Whispers of the Past. The Beheaded Bride of Arundel Castle. The moon hung low over the quiet town of Arundel, casting long shadows over the ancient stone walls of Arundel Castle. A heavy stillness lingered in the air, as though the very land was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Something that had been promised long ago. For centuries, this castle has stood proudly in West Sussex, its stone walls steeped in history and legend. Yet, among the tales of royal blood and long-forgotten battles, there is one that refuses to be silenced. A tale of love, betrayal, and a young bride whose life was stolen before it ever truly began. The tragic fate of the beheaded bride of Arundel Castle has haunted the corridors of this castle for centuries. And tonight, we uncover the truth, or at least, the whispers that remain. In the silence, only the rustling of leaves can be heard, though they seem to sway in a rhythm too deliberate to be natural. Somewhere deep within, hidden from the outside world, there's a story begging to be told. It was late one evening when I arrived at Arundel Castle, a place as much known for its eerie folklore as its rich history. With its stone walls, ivy-clad exterior, and imposing towers, the castle looked as though it had leaped right out of a forgotten time. Its very presence felt like a force, as though it commanded respect from anyone who dared approach. The air was cool and damp, thick with the scent of earth and moss. I walked across the vast courtyard, my footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. As I made my way to the entrance, the castle loomed behind me, its shadow cast far and wide over the land. There was a strange sensation about the place, something that seemed out of place though it wasn't obvious. In the dim light of the courtyard, I met with the local historian, an elderly man who had spent years studying the castle's history. His face was lined with the marks of time, but his eyes held a sharpness that betrayed the weight of knowledge he carried. "You'll find," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "that Arundel is not just a place of history. It's a place where the past refuses to stay buried." As we sat in the dimly lit study inside the castle, the historian began to recount the legend of the beheaded bride. His voice trembled slightly, as if the tale still unsettled him, despite all his years of research. "Her name was Eleanor," he began. "She was promised to a nobleman, a man of great power and influence. Their wedding was to be the grandest affair the kingdom had ever seen. But it was not meant to be. According to the tale, Eleanor had been a beautiful young woman, innocent and pure, eagerly awaiting her wedding day. But as the date drew near, something began to change. Rumors whispered of her betrothed's growing jealousy. Eleanor, it seemed, had caught the eye of a visiting nobleman, a man who had enchanted her with promises of adventure and excitement beyond the castle walls. The night before the wedding, Eleanor was found dead in her chambers. Her throat had been slashed, her head severed from her body. Her betrothed, the man she was meant to marry, was arrested and sentenced to death. But the tragedy did not end there. Eleanor's spirit, some said, remained within the walls of the castle, restless, seeking justice for a crime that had never been fully understood. As the historian spoke, a strange feeling crept up my spine, as though I were not alone in the room. The temperature had dropped, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. I couldn't help but glance around, half expecting to see a figure watching from the shadows. But there was nothing but the flickering candlelight casting long, unsettling shadows across the room. The historian noticed my unease and gave a soft chuckle, though it lacked any real warmth. "You're not the first to feel it," he said. "The castle has a way of revealing itself to those who are willing to listen. Many have claimed to hear whispers in the halls, soft and distant, like a voice calling out from the past. And others claim they've seen her." I raised an eyebrow. "Seen who?" "Eleanor," he replied softly. "They say her ghost haunts the castle, appearing to those who enter her chambers after dark. Some say she is searching for her lost love. Others believe she is seeking vengeance. But the truth is, no one knows for sure." The next night, I decided to venture into the castle on my own, hoping to uncover something more, something real. armed with nothing but a flashlight and a recorder to capture any unexplained noises. I wandered the corridors, letting my footsteps guide me through the vast, silent halls. There was something unnerving about the castle after dark. The stone walls, which during the day seemed comforting in their weight, now felt oppressive, suffocating. The castle groaned and creaked, as though it were alive, shifting and moving in the dark. As I reached the grand staircase, I noticed a faint light flickering from the direction of Eleanor's chambers. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached. The door to her room was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could make out a shadowy figure standing motionless at the far side of the room. I froze. Was it her? Eleanor? I raised my hand to knock on the door but stopped just before my knuckles touched the wood. The figure didn't move. The silence was deafening. And then, in a moment of terrifying clarity, I realized the figure wasn't standing still. It was slowly turning toward me. Its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, cold and hollow, like the depths of the grave. Days passed, but the images of what I had witnessed stayed with me. The historian's words echoed in my mind, but something felt off. The whispers I had heard in the castle weren't just random echoes. They were purposeful, deliberate, as if someone or something was trying to make itself heard. I returned to the castle again, determined to uncover more. This time, I found something I hadn't expected. Hidden in the castle's archives, I discovered an old, dusty journal that belonged to Eleanor herself. Its pages were worn and yellowed with age, but the words were still legible. What I read within those pages shocked me. Eleanor had not been the innocent bride she was portrayed to be. She had been in love, yes, but not with the man she was promised to. The nobleman she had fallen for was not the one who had killed her. In fact, it was the very person who had been tasked with protecting her. The man who would one day be king. But why had she been killed? Why had her head been taken? The journal ended abruptly, as though someone had ripped out the final pages. And yet, I felt that the answer was close. Eleanor's death had not been a random act of jealousy. It had been a cover-up. As the final pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, I made one last visit to the room where Eleanor had died. The air felt different now, heavier, more charged. The whispers that had followed me since my arrival were no longer faint. They were louder, clearer, and they seemed to be coming from all around me. The figure of Eleanor appeared before me once more, her eyes burning with an intensity that was almost too much to bear. She didn't speak, but her gaze was enough. She wanted me to understand, to know the truth. Her death had been no accident. It had been a sacrifice. I finally understood. The betrayal she had suffered was far worse than anyone had realized, and she would never rest until those responsible were brought to justice. The walls of Arundel Castle would hold her secret no longer. The whispers had become a roar, and I knew, deep down, that this story was only just beginning. The days following my encounter with Eleanor's ghost were filled with sleepless nights and restless thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had touched something far darker than I was prepared for. Arundel Castle had revealed its secrets to me, but they were not meant for the faint of heart. Each shadow seemed to hold a whisper. Each creak of the old wooden floors felt like a message from the past. I returned to the castle's archives the next morning, determined to find the missing pages of Eleanor's journal. There had to be more. She had hinted at a deeper conspiracy, something buried under the centuries of royal history. But as I sifted through the dusty tomes, my eyes kept drifting back to the old map of the castle that lay tucked in the back of a drawer. It was an ancient blueprint, much older than the modern renovations, and it marked rooms and corridors that no longer existed, or so I thought. One particular room stood out, a hidden chamber located beneath the castle, one that didn't appear on any current maps. My heart raced as I stared at it. Could this be where Eleanor had spent her last moments? The thought consumed me. I knew what I had to do next. I set out that evening, the cool air biting at my skin as I approached the castle once more. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the moon now hung high, casting long, jagged shadows across the courtyard. It was the perfect time to find the hidden chamber. The castle was deserted, save for a few servants who still moved silently in the far corners of the grounds. Using the blueprint, I descended into the belly of the castle, through narrow corridors that twisted and turned in ways that seemed unnatural. The stones were damp, slick with age, and the further I descended, the more oppressive the air became. The low hum of my flashlight echoed against the stone walls, but it was soon drowned out by something else, something soft and distant. The whispers again. But these whispers were different. They weren't the faint echoes I had heard before. These were sharper, more urgent. As I reached the base of the narrow stairway, I could see it, the entrance to the hidden chamber. A heavy wooden door stood before me, locked and sealed with a rusted iron bar. The whispers seemed to grow louder, as if urging me to open it. I hesitated. Could I really go through with this? What if I uncovered something better left untouched? But the journal, Eleanor's cryptic final words, it all led to this moment. I had to open the door. With trembling hands, I pushed the heavy bar aside and turned the old brass handle. The door creaked open, revealing a chamber far darker and colder than anything I had encountered in the castle before. The chamber was unlike any room in the castle. Its walls were lined with stone that seemed untouched by time. The air was thick with the scent of earth, damp and musty. But there was something else too, a metallic taste that lingered at the back of my throat. As I stepped inside, the floorboards creaked underfoot. The room seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight, making everything appear darker than it truly was. At first, I couldn't see much, but then my beam landed on something that made my stomach twist in discomfort. An altar, set in the center of the room, surrounded by candles long since burned to nubs. The altar was covered in symbols I couldn't decipher, strange markings carved deep into the stone. But the most chilling part was what rested atop the altar. A tattered bridal veil, stained and worn by time. It was unmistakably Eleanor's. The same veil she had worn on her ill-fated wedding day. A feeling of dread washed over me. This wasn't just the scene of her death. This was where her life had been stolen, where the conspiracy that had led to her beheading had begun. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury the truth, and now I was standing at the center of it all. As I examined the veil, a sharp sound echoed through the chamber. Something had moved, something in the shadows. My heart skipped a beat. The whispers had intensified again, louder, now almost screaming in my ears. I wasn't alone. I turned, but the room was empty. Just as I was about to leave the chamber, the temperature in the room dropped, and I could feel a cold presence behind me. A whisper, low and filled with sorrow, reached my ears. "Eleanor?" I called, barely above a whisper, unsure whether my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, before my eyes, she appeared. Eleanor stood before me, her ghostly form glowing faintly in the dark. She was no longer the bride in a tattered gown. Now, she appeared as she had in life, young, beautiful, and full of life. But there was something different about her eyes. They weren't filled with sorrow now. They were filled with rage. "You think you know the truth?" Her voice was soft but carried a weight that reverberated through the walls. "You think my death was an accident? That I died in vain? No, my death was planned. And I was not the only one who suffered." The air crackled as she spoke, and I could feel the energy in the room shift. "Your investigation has only begun," Eleanor continued. "The man who killed me, the man who betrayed me, he's still here in this castle. And he's waiting for the truth to be exposed." I could hardly breathe. I had only thought I understood. But now, Eleanor's words hinted at something darker, something far beyond the betrayal of a young woman. It wasn't just her death that had been covered up. It was a far-reaching conspiracy, woven through the very fabric of the castle itself. The whispers had always been warnings. Eleanor's spirit had not been trapped in time. She had been waiting for someone to uncover the truth. And I was that person. The room began to shake, and a low rumble echoed through the walls, like the sound of something old and forgotten awakening from a long sleep. The shaking stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. Eleanor's figure began to fade, her face twisting in pain. "You have what you need," she whispered, her voice growing softer with each passing second. "Don't let him get away." and just like that, she was gone. I stood there, the weight of her final words sinking in. The man who had killed her, the one who had betrayed her trust, was still here, somewhere within the castle's walls. My heart raced, knowing that the most dangerous part of this journey was yet to come. I exited the hidden chamber and began retracing my steps, but as I did, something caught my eye. There, in the shadows of a nearby hallway, a figure stood watching me. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face obscured by the dim light. His eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating stare. I had found him. The man stepped forward, his presence almost suffocating. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he was savoring every moment of the chase. "You think you've uncovered something, don't you?" he said, his voice cold and controlled. "But you have no idea what you're dealing with." The figure moved closer, the shadows clinging to him like a second skin. He was no stranger to the castle's secrets. He had been there all along. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my mind racing. Who was he? How had he been involved? And why was he here in this very moment when I was so close to the truth? The story was far from over. With each new revelation, the chilling past of Arundel Castle came to life, and the final battle for truth, for justice, for Eleanor was about to begin. With my heart racing, I turned and ran from the chamber, my footsteps echoing through the cold, dark halls of Arundel Castle. I didn't know what awaited me, whether it was the man who had killed Eleanor or something far worse, but I knew one thing for certain. The truth could no longer remain buried, and I was willing to face whatever came next to make sure it didn't.